I never thought a peaceful weekend at my own cabin would end with flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the pine trees, but that's exactly what happened the night Karen, the self proclaimed neighborhood watch, decided I didn't belong on my own property. The cabin sat at the edge of Lake Marrow, a quiet stretch of land my grandfather had built with his bare hands after returning from the war. It was rustic, full of creeks and character, and for me, it was home, a place to escape from the chaos of my job and the noise of the world. I had spent years away working overseas as part of a federal task force, and when I finally took a few weeks off, all I wanted was to sit by the fire and let the sound of crickets replace the endless hum of city life. The first few days were perfect, just me, the lake, and the sound of the wind cutting through the trees. Then Karen showed up. I first noticed her on a Wednesday morning, walking her two yappy poodles up the gravel road that curved past my driveway. She stopped at the gate, hands on hips, squinting like she was trying to read my soul. I gave her a polite wave, but she didn't wave back. Instead, she shouted, "You can't be here. This cabin belongs to the HOA jurisdiction of Pinecrest." I blinked, confused. Pinecrest? That was a new development 2 miles down the road, a place filled with identical houses and perfectly trimmed lawns. My grandfather's cabin predated that HOA by nearly 60 years. "Ma'am," I called back, keeping my tone calm. "I own this property, been in my family for generations." She scoffed, the kind of scoff that made you instantly dislike someone. "Sure you do. We've had squatters trying to claim land out here before. I'll be checking with the association." And with that, she marched off, muttering to herself while her dogs barked like backup singers to her outrage. I didn't think much of it. Every area had its self-appointed enforcers, but the next morning, when I woke up, I noticed something odd. Someone had left a bright orange notice on my gate. It read, "Unauthorized occupancy, pending HOA review." My jaw dropped. The audacity. Not only did she not live anywhere near my property line, but she was now acting as if her homeowners association had jurisdiction over my land. I tore the paper down, crumpled it, and tossed it into the fire pit. That evening, as I was stacking logs, I saw her again, this time with two other people, a man with a clipboard and another woman taking photos. They didn't even ask permission before snapping pictures of my truck, my porch, and the private property sign posted clearly on the fence. "Excuse me." I called out, walking over. "You're trespassing." The man with the clipboard smiled smugly. "We're with the Pinecrest HOA, sir. We've had complaints about an unregistered occupant on restricted property." "Restricted?" I said, biting back a laugh. "Buddy, this land isn't even in your HOA boundaries." Karen cut in sharply. "It's within our oversight area, and if you refuse to leave, we'll have to escalate this matter." That's when I realized she was serious. She wasn't just some nosy neighbor, she was a control freak with a badge of imaginary authority. I took a deep breath and said, evenly, "Go ahead, escalate it. I'd love to see you try." They left soon after, but I could feel their eyes on me from the road as I went back inside. The sun dipped below the trees, and for a while I thought the madness was over. I made dinner, poured a glass of bourbon, and sat on the porch watching the reflection of stars ripple across the lake. Then, at 11:42 p.m., headlights flared against my window. I stepped outside, and two sheriff's cruisers were idling by the gate. Karen stood beside them, her arms crossed triumphantly, her dogs yapping in excitement like they'd just caught a criminal. One of the deputies approached. "Sir, we got a call about a possible break-in and unlawful occupancy." I sighed. "Let me guess, she called you?" The deputy nodded slightly, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am reported someone had broken into this property. Do you have ID or proof of ownership?" I didn't even argue. I walked to my truck, pulled the deed from my glove box, it always stayed there for paperwork reasons, and handed it over. The deputy read the name aloud, then looked at me, eyes widening a little. "Wait, you're that Captain Dawson?" Karen's triumphant smirk faltered. "Captain," she echoed, frowning. I gave a short nod. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Retired. And yes, I still work under the Department of Defense for Infrastructure Security. This land's been in my family since 1953. You just called the police on the owner of one of the oldest registered properties in the county. Her face drained of color. The deputy's partner leaned toward her and said under his breath, "Ma'am, you might want to stand back." But Karen wasn't done. "He's lying," she snapped, jabbing a finger in my direction. "He probably forged that paper." The deputy raised a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, the record matches county registry. This is his land." I watched as the fight drained from her eyes, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, then embarrassment, then anger. "You don't understand," she muttered. "We have community rules. He can't just... He can..." The deputy interrupted. "And you're trespassing by standing on his property." That's when it hit her. She wasn't the authority here. She wasn't in control. And for someone like Karen, that realization was a worse punishment than any fine. She stammered a few words, grabbed her dogs, and stormed back to her car. The officers apologized for the disturbance, and even laughed a little when I told them I'd be filing a complaint for harassment if it happened again. As their taillights disappeared, I stood under the stars, the night air sharp and cold against my face. I thought that would be the end of it, but Karen wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat quietly. What I didn't know then was that she was already plotting her next move, one that would turn my peaceful retreat into a battleground of legal threats, drone surveillance, and the most bizarre war I'd ever fought outside the military. The next morning, I woke to the hum of a drone outside my window, its small propellers slicing through the crisp mountain air like a swarm of angry bees. I pushed open the curtain, half expecting to see some kid playing around, but no. There it was, hovering dead center over my porch, camera pointed straight at me. The second I stepped outside, it darted backward, retreating toward the tree lean where I caught a glimpse of Karen standing on the gravel road, arms folded, phone in hand, recording everything. "You're being monitored," she yelled, voice echoing across the still lake. HOA regulation code allows for aerial inspection when a property is under review. I couldn't help but laugh, not because it was funny, but because the sheer absurdity of her self-importance left me speechless. "Karen," I called back, "you don't have jurisdiction here. That drone crosses onto my property again. I'll file for harassment and invasion of privacy." She smirked and turned away, the drone zipping up higher as if mocking me. I went back inside, made a pot of coffee, and tried to shake it off. But that uneasy feeling crept in again. I'd dealt with insurgent surveillance overseas, but never thought I'd have to use counter-drone tactics on my own land because of an HOA busybody. Around noon, I decided to head into town to see the county clerk. I wanted everything documented: ownership records, GPS coordinates, and legal boundaries. The clerk, an old friend named Marshall, raised his eyebrows when I explained the situation. "You're kidding," he said. "Pine Crest HOA's been trying to expand their authority for months, but they've got no claim past Miller Creek. Your cabin's a mile outside that." I nodded, sliding the latest incident report across his desk. "Good, because if they keep pushing, I'll push back harder." He chuckled, but then his tone turned serious. "Be careful, Dawson. That HOA's president, Karen Blackwell, she's got influence. Knows people on the zoning board." I smiled faintly. So do I. When I returned that evening, I found 2 new signs planted on my property line: private road, HOA access only, and unauthorized structure subject to removal. I stood there for a long moment, jaw tightening. She had crossed from annoying to outright harassment. I took photos, called the sheriff's office, and filed a formal complaint. Deputy Allen, the same one from before, came out to take a look. "We already warned her," he muttered, shaking his head. "She's getting reckless. Leave those signs up for now. We'll use them as evidence." As he left, I noticed Karen's SUV parked just up the hill, her silhouette visible behind the tinted glass. She wasn't hiding. She wanted me to know she was watching. That night, as the wind howled through the trees and the fire crackled in the hearth, I felt the old instincts stirring again, the ones that had kept me alive in combat zones. Surveillance, psychological pressure, small, calculated moves meant to unsettle the target. It was ridiculous that a suburban control freak was using HOA bureaucracy as her weapon, but to her, This was a war of territory and power, and I was the intruder she couldn't control. Over the next week, her campaign escalated. She sent letters claiming unpaid association dues, filed noise complaints when I used my chainsaw to clear fallen branches, and even contacted the local forestry department to accuse me of illegal land alteration. Each time, I countered with documentation, title deeds, zoning maps, and military-grade precision in my wording. Every accusation she threw, I buried in hard evidence. Still, she didn't stop. On the fifth night, I caught her on my security camera creeping up my driveway, flashlight in hand. I waited until she was about 20 feet from the porch before flicking on the floodlights. The look on her face when she saw me standing there, arms crossed, expression calm, was priceless. "Evening, Karen," I said evenly. "Late for a walk, aren't you?" She froze, caught like a deer in headlights. I was checking your boundary markers," she stammered. "You built your fence too, close to the access road." "You mean the private road that doesn't belong to your HOA? I countered. "You're trespassing again." She huffed, trying to regain her authority. "We'll see what the board says about that." And with that, she scurried off, tripping slightly over a root in the dark. I should have felt satisfied watching her retreat, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't just meddling out of boredom. She had something to prove. A few days later, I got a certified letter, an official notice from Pinecrest HOA, demanding immediate removal of my cabin for noncompliance with community development codes. I nearly spit out my coffee laughing. My cabin had stood since 1953. The HOA itself was barely a decade old. But the letter wasn't funny, it was dangerous. If I ignored it, she'd try to push it through legal channels. So I went on the offensive. I contacted the county's legal affairs department and scheduled a meeting with the district zoning attorney. When I showed them the letter, they were appalled. "They have no authority over your parcel," the attorney said firmly. "If they proceed, it's harassment under Section 74B. I smiled grimly. "Then I'll let them proceed." "Excuse me," the attorney blinked. "Let them dig their own hole," I said. "I'll be ready when they fall in." That weekend, I made sure the cabin was spotless, the documents framed, and my cameras positioned perfectly. Because if Karen wanted a war, I was going to give her one, but I'd fight it by the book. Sure enough, 2 days later, I heard the sound of gravel crunching. A convoy of HOA board members, 3 cars strong, pulled up to my gate. Karen stepped out first, holding a clipboard like it was a sword. "You are in violation of Pinecrest Residential Code," she began, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We are issuing a final notice before demolition." I didn't say a word. Instead, I held up my phone, recording everything. "You're trespassing again, and I've already reported your fraudulent notices to the county." She blinked, then laughed nervously. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I said, pulling a folded letter from my jacket, the official zoning statement signed by the county attorney himself. The color drained from her face as she read it. Her board members exchanged confused glances, realizing they'd just walked into something much bigger. "You've got 30 seconds to clear my property," I said quietly, "or this video goes straight to the sheriff and the county press." For the first time, Karen had no words. She turned to leave, muttering something about miscommunication, but I could tell by her trembling hands that she was shaken. As their cars rolled away, I exhaled slowly. The silence that followed was heavy but satisfying. Yet even then, I knew this battle wasn't done. Karen wasn't the kind to surrender. She'd lost her footing, but not her obsession. And I had the uneasy feeling that the next move she made would be even more dangerous, something that would test my patience, my resolve, and maybe even my safety. The following week brought a deceptive calm that almost made me think Karen had finally given up. The nights were quiet, the air smelled of pine and rain, and for 3 whole days, no signs, no drones, and no unwanted visitors appeared near my property. I started to relax again, spending my mornings fishing off the dock, and my evenings rebuilding the old porch swing my grandfather had carved decades ago. But in my experience, silence wasn't peace, it was the calm before a strike. And I was right. On the fourth morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery in the distance. At first, I thought it was logging crews working near the county line, but when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. Two bulldozers and a cement truck were parked at the edge of my northern property where the old logging trail met the main road. A group of workers wearing reflective vests were unloading construction markers and surveying equipment. I strode over, boots crunching against the gravel, and called out, "What's going on here?" One of the men turned, clipboard in hand. "Morning, sir. Pine Crest HOA development project, road expansion for new housing access. We've been cleared to start preliminary grading today." I froze, anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. Cleared by who? He flipped through his papers. Authorization signed by HOA President Karen Blackwell. My jaw clenched. "That's illegal," I said firmly. "You're standing on private property. This land doesn't belong to Pine Crest." The man frowned, looking genuinely confused. "Ma'am said this section was under community jurisdiction. She even showed us a zoning map." I shook my head and pulled out my phone. "You're about to find out how wrong she is." Within minutes, I had Deputy Allen on the line. When he arrived 20 minutes later, Karen was already there, standing proudly beside the bulldozers, arms folded like a queen surveying her empire. "Good morning, Captain," she said mockingly, emphasizing the title as though it were a joke. "Hope you don't mind the noise. The community's expanding, and unfortunately, that means we need to make improvements to public access." I stared at her, disbelief giving way to fury. "This isn't public access, Karen. This is my land. You forged a permit." She tilted her head with a smirk. "The board voted on it. The board doesn't have legal jurisdiction here." I turned to Alan. "You see the boundary markers?" He nodded. "Plain as day." Karen scoffed. "Markers can be moved." That's when I lost the last thread of patience I had left. I stepped forward, voice low and controlled. "Karen, listen to me carefully. You are on private federal surveyed land, owned by me, registered with the Department of Natural Resources. If you or anyone here moves a single rock of soil, you'll be charged with property damage, trespassing, and obstruction of county code." Alan stepped between us, raising a hand. "All right, let's all take a breath. Ma'am, I need your authorization documents." Karen handed over a folder. I watched as Alan flipped through the pages, then stopped, eyebrows furrowing. "Karen," he said slowly, "these documents are missing signatures. There's no county stamp, just the HOA letterhead." "That's because we're still in the process," she said quickly. "The paperwork is pending approval." "Pending means not approved," Alan replied flatly. "You're in violation." Her smug smile faltered as Alan turned to the construction crew. "Pack it up, fellas. You're trespassing here, and I suggest you clear out before I start writing citations." The foreman didn't argue. Within minutes, the machines powered down, and the workers began loading their gear back into the trucks. Karen fumed, her face turning redder by the second. "This isn't over," she hissed at me. "You can't bully me off land that belongs to the community." I met her glare evenly. "It doesn't belong to you, Karen. You can't control what you don't own." She stormed off toward her car, her tires spinning gravel as she sped away, leaving behind only the acrid smell of diesel and frustration. I thought that would finally put an end to her antics, but I underestimated just how far she was willing to go. 2 nights later, I was woken by flashing lights again, this time not police but fire trucks. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and saw flames flickering near the far edge of my property. The old shed, the one that had stored tools and paint cans since my grandfather's time, was engulfed in orange light. I grabbed the hose, though it was a losing battle until the fire crew arrived. The blaze was contained quickly, but most of the structure was gone, just blackened timbers and twisted metal. The fire chief, an older man named Briggs, came over shaking his head. "You got any enemies around here?" he asked quietly. I glanced toward the road, where a familiar SUV idled for a moment before disappearing into the night. Maybe I said, "Why?" He knelt beside the remains. Accelerant pattern. Someone started this intentionally. My hands tightened into fists. "You can prove that." He nodded grimly. We'll have forensics confirm, but yeah, it wasn't an accident. I barely slept that night, sitting by the embers of my ruined shed with a rifle resting across my knees. Not to use, but because the feel of it steadied me. Every instinct told me this was Karen's doing, though proving it would be tricky. I decided then and there I wouldn't play defense anymore. The next morning, I called a few contacts from my old unit, people who now worked in various government offices. Within hours, I had aerial maps, historical records, and satellite overlays showing every inch of my property line. I compiled it all into a report and sent copies to the county, the sheriff, and the local news outlet. I didn't mention Karen by name, but I made sure the timing aligned perfectly with her little expansion project. 2 days later, the story hit the local paper. HOA attempts illegal expansion onto private land. Federal records confirm boundary violations. The photos showed my burned shed, the bulldozers, and Karen's name as HOA president. I didn't need to say a word. The truth did the talking for me. When I drove into town that afternoon, people were whispering. At the hardware store, a clerk handed me my receipt and said under his breath, "Heard you shut that Pine Crest woman down good." I gave a small nod, though inside I felt no victory, only resolve. I knew Karen would come for me again. People like her didn't quit. When they were cornered, they doubled down. And when she did, I'd be ready because this was no longer about property or pride. It was about principle. She wanted control, but I had something far more powerful: patience, evidence, and the law on my side. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the sense that she was planning something bigger, something she believed would finally destroy me. I just didn't realize how far she was willing to go until I caught her next move on camera, a move that would make the entire county turn against her once and for all. It was a cold Saturday morning when I discovered just how far Karen's obsession had spiraled. Frost clung to the pine needles, and the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. I had just finished chopping firewood when I heard a faint buzzing sound again, the same tone I'd heard before when her drone came snooping around. But this time, it wasn't just one. As I looked up, 3 drones hovered above my property, forming a slow circle pattern like vultures over a carcass. I could feel my blood pressure rise. They weren't just filming my cabin, they were scanning the perimeter, dipping close enough that I could see the blinking red cameras capturing every inch of my land. "All right, Karen," I muttered under my breath. "You want to play games? Let's play." I walked inside, pulled out my phone, and accessed my security feed. My cameras had recorded every flight path, every angle, every timestamp. I then checked my inbox, and there it was, an email from the Pinecrest HOA legal department accusing me of environmental code violations, complete with aerial images of my property attached as evidence. The photos clearly came from those drones. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it until I noticed something else. One of the pictures showed me standing by the lake, holding my rifle from the night of the fire. She was now framing me as a threat. The caption beneath the image read, "Suspected armed trespasser observed occupying restricted land." That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just trying to take my land. She was trying to paint me as a dangerous man, a criminal. My jaw tightened as I scrolled through the attachments, each more manipulative than the last. She'd even blurred the timestamp to make it appear as though the photo was recent. This was deliberate, calculated, and criminal. I didn't waste time. I contacted my old colleague, Lieutenant Jameson, now working in cyber forensics. Within an hour, I'd sent him the drone footage and metadata. "Give me 24 hours, he said. "I'll find out exactly where those drones are registered and who's controlling them." The next day, I got the confirmation. Every single one of those drones was registered under the name Pinecrest Homeowners Association, President Karen Blackwell. That was all I needed. I compiled the evidence into a report, attached the photos, the metadata trail, and the forged complaint letter she'd sent me. Then I drove straight to the sheriff's department. Alan met me at the front desk, his expression grim when he saw the file. "She's crossed the line this time," he said, flipping through the pages. "You've got her dead to rights." "Good," I replied evenly, "because I'm done letting her harass me." Alan promised to escalate the matter to the district attorney, and I left feeling a flicker of satisfaction. But it didn't last long. That night, just as the last light faded over the lake, I heard voices outside. Not one, not two, several. I stepped onto the porch and saw headlights moving down the path, followed by the unmistakable flash of camera lights. News vans. Karen had actually called the media. "There he is," she shouted, pointing toward me as she stood before a local reporter. "That's the man threatening our neighborhood, armed, unstable, and squatting on HOA-protected land." My stomach twisted, not from fear, but from disbelief at her audacity. The reporter looked uneasy, holding a microphone toward me. "Sir, would you care to comment?" I didn't say a word. Instead, I turned my phone's camera on, recording the entire spectacle. "You're trespassing," I said calmly. "This is private land. Leave now, or I'll have the sheriff escort you out." Karen stepped forward, practically foaming with self-righteous fury. "You can't hide behind fake ownership. We've filed for an injunction." "Then you'll love this," I said, reaching into my jacket. I pulled out a copy of the official county statement, the same one I'd used before, and handed it to the reporter. "This is the legally verified deed for this property, predating Pinecrest HOA by over 50 years. Every claim she's made is false. She's under investigation for harassment and property violation as of this morning." The reporter's expression shifted instantly. He turned toward Karen. "Ma'am, is this true?" Karen blinked, suddenly looking unsure. He's lying," she stammered. "He's manipulating the records." "Then why does the sheriff's department confirm his ownership?" I asked. "You want a real story?" Ask her why 3 drones registered to her HOA were illegally surveilling my property. The color drained from her face. The cameras turned on her now, questions flying faster than she could answer. "Ms. Blackwell, did you authorize surveillance of private property? Were those photos submitted as evidence in a falsified report? Are you aware this could constitute a criminal offense?" She backed away, muttering denials, her perfect image cracking under the spotlight she'd invited. I could almost feel her panic radiating off her. Within minutes, her press conference had turned into a public meltdown. I didn't need to say another word. I simply walked back inside, closing the door behind me as her shrill voice echoed down the driveway. The next morning, the story hit every local station. HOA president accused of harassment and illegal surveillance. The footage showed her yelling, looking unhinged, while I stood calm and collected. My inbox filled with messages from neighbors I'd never met, most apologizing for how she'd treated me. Even members of the Pinecrest HOA board began resigning, not wanting their names tied to her scandal. But as much as I wanted to believe it was over, I knew Karen's kind too well. Public humiliation would only make her more desperate. And I was right. 2 nights later, I came home from a late trip into town and found my front gate wide open. My security system had been disabled, wires cut cleanly. I moved cautiously, my flashlight sweeping the yard. Then I saw it, spray painted in red across my cabin's front door, "Get out or pay." My stomach turned cold. This wasn't just petty revenge anymore. This was intimidation. I called Alan immediately, and within an hour, deputies were on scene taking photos and dusting for prints. "She's unhinged," he muttered. "We'll get her, but you might want to lay low for a while." I shook my head. "No, I'm not leaving my home." That night, I reinforced my security cameras, set motion sensors along the driveway, and left floodlights on every corner of the property. I wasn't scared, I was ready. Because now it wasn't about one woman's obsession with power. It was about standing up to every bully who thought rules only applied to others. As I sat on the porch, staring out into the moonlit forest, I could feel it. Karen was still out there planning something reckless. And this time, she was going to cross a line she could never come back from. The next few days crawled by in a tense, eerie quiet that made every snapping twig sound like a warning. I barely slept, spending my nights watching the live security feeds from my laptop, scanning for any sign of movement near the property line. The sheriff's deputies increased their patrols around my area, and the fire investigation was still ongoing. But I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her never admitted defeat. They just found new ways to get even. On the third night, it happened. Just past midnight, my driveway sensors tripped. The motion alerts flashed across my screen, one after another, indicating multiple heat signatures approaching from the east side of the property. I muted the alerts, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside, careful to stay in the shadows. The air was cold, my breath visible in the pale light from moon. I crouched behind the woodpile, eyes fixed on the treeline, and then I saw them, three figures moving carefully along the fence. One held a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, while another carried a metal canister. The smell hit me a second later, gasoline. My chest tightened. They were going to burn me out. Without a word, I pressed the emergency call button on my phone, sending a direct alert to the sheriff's office. Then I stepped into the open, flashlight in one hand, phone camera rolling in the other. "You've got 30 seconds to explain what you're doing," I called out. The figures froze, startled. The one with the canister dropped it, spilling fuel across the ground. When the light hit their faces, my blood ran cold. It was Karen and two of her HOA board members. "You're trespassing," I said sharply. "Step away from the property right now." Karen's face twisted into something unrecognizable, anger mixed with desperation. "You don't belong here," she shouted, voice cracking. "You've ruined everything. The HOA's collapsing, the board's turned against me, and it's all because of you." I kept the camera steady. "So, your solution is arson?" She glared at me, eyes wild. "You think you can hide behind your rank, your connections, your stupid title? Well, not anymore. When this cabin's gone, you'll have nothing left to prove." Her words hit like bullets, but I didn't flinch. "Karen, put the gun down," I said quietly. "This is your last warning." Behind her, one of the board members tugged her arm. "Karen, stop, he's filming. The cops are coming." She jerked free, trembling with rage. "I'm not afraid of him," she hissed. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder. Karen looked toward the road, panic flickering across her face as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. "It's over," I said calmly. "Step back before you make it worse." For a moment, she just stood there, her expression shifting between fury and fear, and then she dropped the can and bolted for the woods. The two men followed, stumbling in their rush to escape. Within minutes, the deputies arrived, Alan among them. I replayed the footage for him, every word, every movement captured in perfect clarity. He whistled under his breath. "She's done," he muttered. "Breaking and entering attempted arson conspiracy. This is enough to put her away." I nodded silently as he and the other officers spread out to search the woods. They found her an hour later, hiding near the creek, shivering from the cold. When they brought her back in cuffs, she didn't look defiant anymore. She looked hollow, defeated. Our eyes met briefly as they loaded her into the cruiser, and for the first time, I saw the truth. Beneath all her arrogance and control, she was terrified. Maybe of prison, maybe of losing the power she'd built her life around. Either way, it was over. The deputies spent the rest of the night collecting evidence, the gas can, the footprints, the damaged fence where they'd slipped through. When they left, the quiet returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I sat on the porch until sunrise, watching the first light touch the lake. I should have felt vindicated, maybe even relieved, but all I felt was tired. I'd spent my life dealing with threats, foreign and domestic, but nothing prepared me for the sheer madness of suburban warfare. Over the next few days, the news broke again. HOA president arrested in arson attempt against private landowner. Her mugshot was everywhere. No makeup, eyes red from crying, the face of a woman who'd gone too far. The Pinecrest HOA dissolved within a week. The county seized their funds, the remaining board members resigned, and property owners voted to dismantle the association entirely. The local paper called it a triumph of accountability, but to me, it was just the end of a very long nightmare. Still, there was one more surprise waiting. About a week later, I received a letter from Karen's attorney. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea. Inside was a handwritten note from Karen herself, shaky but legible. It read, "I don't expect forgiveness. I lost myself somewhere between rules and revenge. I'm sorry." I sat there for a long time, staring at that note. I didn't reply, but I didn't throw it away either. I folded it carefully and placed it in the old desk drawer beside my grandfather's maps. Maybe it was a reminder, not of victory, but of how far people can fall when pride consumes them. The sheriff stopped by one last time that evening. She took a plea deal. Alan said, 2 years probation, community service, psychiatric evaluation. She's banned from holding any HOA position again. I nodded. Good. Maybe she'll find peace in that. He smiled faintly. You handled this better than most would have. Hell, half the town's calling you a hero. I shook my head. Heroes don't live for revenge. They just endure it. After he left, I walked down to the lake. The surface was smooth and still, the reflection of the trees stretching across the water like a mirror to everything I'd endured. I took a deep breath, the air crisp and clean again, free of smoke and tension. The cabin was safe. The land was mine, but more than that, it was quiet, peaceful, the way it was always meant to be. I knew life would move on, the story fading into local legend, another cautionary tale about control and consequences. But as I watched the sun set behind the ridge, I promised myself one thing. No matter what storms came next, I'd never let anyone take my peace again. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. After Karen's arrest and the eventual collapse of the HOA, life at the cabin shifted from chaos to calm, though the silence that followed felt almost unnatural at first. For weeks, I'd wake up expecting the sound of confrontation, a knock at the door, the crunch of tires on gravel, the shrill tone of someone demanding compliance. But none came. The only sounds were the forest breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional call of a hawk echoing through the valley. It was as if the land itself had exhaled a sigh of relief. I spent those early mornings walking the perimeter, inspecting what had survived the madness. The singed edges of the old fence, the footprint marks from that night's confrontation, the charred patch where gasoline had spilled. All reminders that peace isn't something given, it's something earned. Slowly, I began repairing everything Karen and her board had broken. I replaced the fence, rebuilt the tool shed they'd vandalized, and planted a row of birch trees along the boundary as a living barrier between my property and what used to be HOA-controlled land. It was therapeutic, grounding me in something real after months of conflict. When the last nail was hammered and the last brushstroke of paint dried, I stood back and looked around. The cabin looked whole again, not just structurally, but spiritually. The irony was that I'd bought the cabin years ago to escape the world, but it was only after all this that I truly learned what solitude meant. One cold evening in late December, as snow began to fall in soft, heavy flakes, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Sheriff Allen, bundled up in his winter coat, a thermos of coffee in one hand. Mind if I sit? He asked. I nodded and poured him a cup from my own pot. We sat on the porch, watching the snow settle across the frozen lake. She moved, he said after a while, meaning Karen. Sold her house last week. Left town for good. I didn't say anything, just stared into the fire pit, glowing between us. She's been going to counseling. From what I hear, he continued, working at a community center downstate. Guess she's trying to make amends. I nodded slowly. Good for her, I said. People can change if they want to. He gave me a small, knowing smile. You still keeping the place year-round? I think so, I said, gazing toward the cabin windows glowing warm against the winter dusk. It feels different now. Safer. Like it belongs to me again. We sat in silence after that, two men who'd seen enough of the world to understand that peace is fragile but worth protecting. When he left, I stayed outside a while longer, letting the snow cover my boots. That night, I found myself looking through old photos, my grandfather standing where I now stood, proud and strong, holding the deed to this same land. He built this cabin after returning from war, carving his peace out of the wilderness. I finally understood what he must have felt, that freedom isn't about isolation, but about standing firm against anything that tries to take it away. I poured myself a drink and raised a quiet toast to him, to the land, and to the strange, hard journey that brought me back to myself. In the spring, something remarkable happened. The county invited me to speak at a local community forum about property rights, HOAs, and conflict resolution. I almost declined. Public speaking wasn't my thing. But then I thought about the neighbors who'd watched this all unfold, people too afraid to stand up for themselves against petty power. So I went. Standing at that small town podium, looking out at familiar faces, I told the story as it was, not dramatized, not glorified, just the truth. How a simple misunderstanding spiraled into a war of control, and how one person's obsession with power nearly destroyed everything around her. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then people began to clap, slow, deliberate, sincere. Afterward, a few homeowners came up to thank me, saying they'd been inspired to take a stand in their own communities. For the first time in a long while, I felt like something good had come out of the chaos. Months turned into a year. The trees grew taller, the birds returned, and the cabin became not just a retreat but a home. I built a small dock at the edge of the lake, where I'd spend mornings fishing and evenings watching the sunset reflect in the still water. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling for no reason, just grateful that the noise was gone. Every so often, a memory would surface, the flashing lights, Karen's wild eyes, the crackle of fire in the dark. But they didn't haunt me anymore. They were just echoes of a chapter that had closed. One afternoon, while clearing out the old desk, I found Karen's letter again, the one where she'd apologized. I read it once more, slower this time, and for the first time, I believed her. I took it outside, burned it in the fire pit, and watched the ashes rise into the sky. Goodbye, I murmured, not to her, but to everything that had happened. By summer, the land was thriving again, green, alive, untamed in the best way. I invited a few close friends from the service to visit, and when they arrived, they couldn't believe the story. "You always find trouble, don't you?" one joked. I laughed, shaking my head. "Trouble finds me," I said. That night, we sat around the fire, trading stories and laughter that carried into the trees. The cabin felt alive, with warmth again, no longer a battlefield but a sanctuary. When they left, one of them clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You ever think about running for office? You'd make one hell of a leader." I smiled. No politics for me. I'm done with people telling others how to live. Years from now, I know the story of Karen and the cabin will still be whispered around this town, part cautionary tale, part legend. Some will call it justice, others revenge. But for me, it's simply the truth of what happens when pride meets patience. I didn't win by fighting, I won by enduring. The HOA, the titles, the threats, they were all temporary. What lasted was this: the quiet, the land, and the knowledge that peace once fought for must be protected with everything you have. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the water shimmered gold, I stood at the end of the dock and felt something I hadn't in years: absolute stillness. No fear, no anger, no ghost left to chase. Just the sound of the wind through the pines and the memory of a fight that had finally, mercifully ended. I smiled to myself and whispered, "Home." Because after everything, the arrests, the fire, the battles of ego and law, that's what it was. My home, my peace, my victory.